My name is Dave Christie, and I'm with the Schiller Institute, one of the representatives here in the Northwest. We have a team of us that work together to promote the ideas of the new paradigm as we have spent some decades, many decades actually, involved in organizing some of the conceptions around it. So I'd also like to thank, of course, Mr. Shu here, who is the coordinator here at NanHai for obviously hosting the venue. And then as well, Tim Lee, who many of you know, who is the founder of the Bellevue Chinese Chamber of Commerce, who also has sponsored this event today. And then obviously our presenters, Dr. Zang from the University of Washington. He's the director of the Asian Law Center there. And Dr. Hal Cooper, who is actually a consultant based here in Kirkland, who's been a longtime collaborator of the Schiller Institute and actually recently went and spoke in front of Dr. Zhang's class. So in some ways, what I'd like to do is start out as somewhat of a reflection of the discussion that the community here in the Northwest has been having about the implications of the One Belt, One Road. But what I'd like to do is give a brief sense, because obviously we'd like to just give somewhat brief presentations so that we can actually hear from other people as well and have a dialogue, you know, in terms of what it means, both what this project means for the world, and as I know that what I am interested in is how the United States comes into this, and Dr. Cooper has been involved in other discussions about how the United States integrates into the One Belt, One Road, the New Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. It has these different names, but it's a similar conception. But what I'd like to do is give a brief sense of how the Schiller Institute and its founders, Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche, somewhat their historic role in this, not just from the past, but also the ideas and conceptions that are going to be required to bring about the implications that are with the New Silk Road, which includes the so-called multipolar world that we see in action with the BRICS nations. That's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping. And these are a growing roster of nations that would like to see economic relations based on mutual benefit, the so-called win-win cooperation. And as far as the integration of that, and also the this bringing together of this multipolar approach, there was a very high premium recently placed, and continues to be placed, on the strategic partnership between Russia and China, and as part of this multipolar approach, the integration of the New Silk Road together with the Eurasian Economic Union. Now those nations include Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. So this really is coming together, and what I would like to focus on is some of the principles that will help bring all nations into this multipolar approach and get away from the unipolar approach, which is really the antiquated ideas of geopolitics as practiced by the old imperial crowd, especially, you know, as the most recent manifestation within the British Empire. So perhaps just to pull up the PowerPoint there, it's this guy right there. I don't know if you can make that any larger there. If people can see this, the EIR magazine on the left, that you see it says the Eurasian Rail Project paves the road to peace. Now this is an EIR article from the organization that I work with, and the executive director, the editor of the EIR is Mr. LaRouche that helped found the Schiller Institute. Already in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union had broken apart, we had posed this to governments around the world as a means to integrate based on real economic development that through higher infrastructure platforms. That discussion then was carried into a series of conferences, and this blue report on the right indicates a conference that we had in Beijing in 1996, where we were involved in a discussion process with people in the Chinese government and beyond about this concept of the new Silk Road. Now, the LaRouche movement always intended that this would be a world land bridge. So perhaps I think the next, well, this just shows a little bit of an illustration of some of the major trunk lines that we were posing back in the early 90s as part of this new Silk Road conception. And this next image, I somewhat like it for those of you that are familiar with, subway stops. This is somebody's recent, making it live about what this actually means for the Eurasian continent. Obviously, it is a gigantic venture. Now, obviously, the discussions that we were having in the 1990s did not come to fruition in the sense of the new Silk Road being official policy until 2013. And that's when Xi Jinping at Nazarbayev University announced it as official policy. Now, I know Dr. Zang is going to cover some of the more recent developments. He'll also touch on some of the, the problems of how do you actually bring all these different nations and interests, and what does the legal framework require, what are, some of the financial framework, etc. So I'll leave that to him to give some of the modern implications of this. But as I said, we always intended that this would become a world land bridge. And I think the next image, if I'm not mistaken, this is from actually I think this, okay, there was a CNN article that actually covered the call by Vladimir Yakunin, which was to have a tunnel underneath the Bering Strait. Now this man, Dr. Cooper here, has actually done a feasibility study for not only the Bering Strait crossing, which for those of you that think it sounds like a wild idea, the two segments, there's an island in the middle between Alaska and Russia, and the two segments from one part of the island to the other, or one side of Russia to the island, to the Alaska to the island, those two segments are actually shorter than the English Channel Tunnel. So it's not inconceivable, but of course we know the geopolitical tensions that exist. And that's actually brings me to the point of, that we intended that this would be a world land bridge, that this would be connected to a larger rail grid within the United States, and that this be done from the standpoint of this multipolar world coming into existence. So now at the same time that, let's try this. How does that work? Does that
sounds better. Yeah.
Okay. So now at the same time that the Schiller Institute was organizing around the project for the new Silk Road, as well as this multipolar approach that was originally the strategic triangle, as it was called in the late 90s. That was Russia, India, China. That became the seed crystal for what I mentioned earlier was today called the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping. That part of what gave an impetus to this was Mr. LaRouche's insistence that the transatlantic financial system could not sustain itself based on the model that it existed upon, of which that model has not changed. Now I'd like to just show you an image that Mr. LaRouche developed in 1995. Actually, this is just briefly, this is the new report that we have entitled "The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge," that outlines a myriad of other projects that would become global. But anyway, back to 1995, the next slide here. Oh, one more forward. I'm kind of skipping around based on my earlier idea of the presentation here. This is what Mr. LaRouche had developed to get at what a collapse function actually looks like in terms of ultimately a deviation between your financial and monetary side of the economy to the physical economy. And what was occurring within the transatlantic system was a kind of a cannibalization of the physical economy. We were not improving infrastructure. In fact, we were, like I say, sort of cannibalizing it in the sense of allowing attrition to take over, but also exporting high-skilled jobs to places where it was so-called cheaper, but there was a certain infrastructure that had developed that allowed for those high-skilled jobs to be here, including education, including transportation grid, communication systems, all those that elements of an economy that helped create a high-tech capability. Those jobs were just sent overseas. At the same time that we saw an increase of financial aggregates that did not correspond to the physical economy that was collapsing. And so this is what Mr. LaRouche developed as a basic pedagogy, to the point that what we see now is the monetary aggregates, which of course we see this with quantitative easing since the 2007-2008 collapse. We have done nothing but continue to just ramp up the money printing, while at the same time allowing our physical economy to collapse even further. So I raise this because in 1995, it was this idea of the nature of the transatlantic financial system which ultimately led Mr. LaRouche to call out the collapse of the Southeast Asian financial crisis, or he warned of that in 1997. And when that happened, I think there were those in the Chinese government that took our call for the new Silk Road and a new approach to physical economics, to actually building your basic economic infrastructure as a platform to grow, to have a high-tech economy eventually, right? And so, so I raise that because we are presently at a similar moment, and I just want to read a couple of points to somewhat back up this this point here. Giulio Tremonti, who is somewhat of a collaborator over the years, he was also the former finance minister of Italy. And what he just wrote, he said, since 2007, the causes of the crisis are all still there. The excess liquidity that caused the crisis 10 years ago is today exponentially higher. Finance is undergoing a frightening genetic mutation. All the elements producing the famous bubbles are all there. He goes on to talk about various historical bubbles, but he's making the point that we've done nothing different since the collapse other than print even more money through quantitative easing and other agencies. The other side of this is that a lot of this financial activity is going into things like stock buybacks. The International Monetary Fund just put out a report earlier this year saying that if the interest rates, if the Federal Reserve were to raise interest rates to the level they were before the 2007-2008 collapse, that 20% of non-financial corporations in the United States would go under. Because a lot of what's going on right now is the corporations are involved in stock buybacks and so forth. So they're getting cheap money through the operations of the Federal Reserve and then just buying up their own stock. In fact, Tom Honig, who is, I believe, the vice chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, just wrote a letter to the Senate Banking Committee saying, look, all the profits of the banks over this last year are going into, 80% of that is stock buybacks, the remaining 20% is going into dividends, which also are going into stock buybacks. So there's a kind of, all of this financial activity is not going into the real economy. Those bank profits are not going back into real lending for the real economy. And that's what this gets at, is just an indication that we're allowing the physical economic base to collapse out from under us. This is why half of you are probably late because of the traffic, because there's no real infrastructure to speak of. But at the same time, the money printing goes on. So I raise this because the question of the United States actually joining this new approach that we see going on with China in terms of the creating new platforms of development for these nations, especially in Central Asia and so on, that this is a viable form. And I know that there is a lot of attacks that come out. There was one just a couple of years ago from the Schiller Institute, or it's out of Oxford University, the Schiller Business School, which basically tried to make the point that the $10.8 trillion that within the last decade alone that China has put into these kind of projects around the New Silk Road, that is leading to their collapse. Now, if you think about just the short-term gains that is demanded by those within the transatlantic financial system, those within Wall Street and London, who would like short-term gains at high interest rates, versus what China is actually doing, is they're enacting the idea that you can put out low interest rate credit to build up the physical economy, and that you're not interested in the immediate returns, because some of these returns are not going to come back immediately. You think of some of these transportation routes that might take 20 years to build. You won't see the benefits of those until far down the road. And this is frankly the approach that we took under Alexander Hamilton. This is the approach we saw under Franklin Roosevelt, what he did with the New Deal. This was the approach that Abraham Lincoln took with the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is what we have to now bring back to the United States, is that outlook. And so that's what we're calling on for the United States to join this new, this type of real physical economic growth. And because of the time, I think I'll just perhaps leave a later part of the my presentation. Actually, what I'd like to do is just simply point to what Mr. LaRouche has developed with what he calls the 4 laws. That includes the Glass-Steagall banking standards, which separates your commercial banks away from the investment banks, and by so doing, does not allow government bailouts for the Wall Street activities, but it rather provides that the EIC was actually created as part of the Glass-Steagall banking standards, because commercial banking activity that was involved in lending to the real economy, that would be protected under the federal umbrella, because they were not engaging in risky speculation. They were not engaging in derivatives and mortgage-backed securities and these kind of things. But what that will do is orient a relationship back that the financial and monetary side of the economy is oriented towards the advancement of the physical economy. Because if it's not around that, then what is it for? Now, it also, the 4 laws involves Glass-Steagall, which, as just a brief picture, the Chinese government did adopt a Glass-Steagall standard in the early 1990s. And I think that's part of why they have their commercial banking system oriented to the physical economy, as we see with these large-scale projects. In addition to Glass-Steagall, you would have a national credit policy, the way that Alexander Hamilton designed it. And then, of course, infrastructure, which is at a higher platform than the previous platform. So in other words, we're making a kind of progress through scientific and technological advancement. And then the 4th domain would be a science driver program, particularly oriented around fusion technology. So I just mentioned that partly because, as I say, we're kind of running a little bit over time, but we do have literature that goes into these 4 laws. But if we have to go back, as the United States have to go back to this same orientation that is being built by, or that the New Silk Road is being built by, really does have its roots in the American system that we saw under Alexander Hamilton. It's the same conceptions, and that we need to go back to that orientation, because we face this financial collapse that is barreling down upon us. So I think what we should do now, I think Dr. Zang, you were planning to, yeah, so Dr. Zang, again, the director of the Asian Law Center, and we can just pull up the yeah, maybe.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a great honor. My name is Dongshun Zang. I also go by the name Bang Zang to make it easier for my colleagues. Yes. Okay. So I've been teaching at the UW Law School for more than 10 years. I'm going to talk about the new Silk Road in China that needs a legal bridge. So I will explain. I will start, since I came from the academic, so I'm going to give you the big picture, right? I'm sure Dr. Cooper will give you the technical details. Next please. So the One Belt, One Road initiative is very, very ambitious, very, very broad projects. Basically, there are two lines. One is on the top, that is the continental railway line, so that's the traditional Silk Road. And then there's also a maritime line coming from China to South China Sea, and then to the Indian Ocean, and then to the Middle East, and then all the way to Europe. So these two lines are the essential components of the One Belt, One Road. So next please. For China and some of the countries participating in the One Belt, One Road, this is a kind of a revival of the old Silk Road. So there is enormous rhetoric about the glory of the past and then the future. Next please. The One Belt, One Road is really very, very much not covered in the American media. You probably, even if you read the Wall Street Journal, as I do every day, you don't see much, right? American media largely ignores what's going on. But in May this year, this is reported, but still that we don't have a sense of the scale that China actually had a magnificent gathering of the world leaders coming to Beijing to talk about the One Belt, One Road. So to lay out more detailed plans on this. And it's also not just a project, but also financing and other arrangements. So it's extremely exciting development if you're part of that. For political reasons, the United States is not part of it. Japan is not part of it. European countries are much more involved. India is interested. Also, a lot of the countries in between Europe and China are more involved. So overall, there are 62 countries involved in the One Belt, One Road. And we're talking about billions of dollars. So next page, please. So in general, continue. So in general, the idea was developed 2013 when President Xi Jinping was visiting Southeast Asia, and he started talking about reviving the new the Silk Road. So that was the beginning. That was 2013, and then next. And then after the president's speech, the key regulatory agencies started developing it more, and then make it a national strategy. So that's the December 2014. And then next, please. So it was in March 2015 that this was considered that after serious thought, we're going to implement this. So there's 2 years of development of this strategy. Next, please. A lot of this is infrastructure building. Railway is a big part of it, so I'm going to talk about railway because Dr. Cooper will talk more. But also it includes energy and other sectors. So China is building along the One Belt One Road, along the railway. China is also building power plants, dams, and maybe hospitals. So we're talking about enormously large-scale infrastructure development, largely financed by China, but with the participation of the number of countries. So that's why there's legal concerns that we're going to talk about. Next, please. So in the Chinese media, there's I just want to show some pictures to show the railroad development between linking China and Europe. 3 lines. This is slightly vague. Next page will be clearer. So 3 lines connecting China and Europe. All these 3 lines are in operation. So if you are in China, you will be very excited because the major media is reporting progress every day on a regular basis, reporting, this line is opening and that line is operating. And so it's very, very, dramatic development. So next, please. It covers some of the Central Asian countries, some of the Uzbekistan. And so this is a picture from the Chinese official newspaper, the People's Daily, reporting this progress, right? So next, please. Celebrating the operation of China and Europe means from Beijing to London, Beijing to Spain, Beijing to Moscow, Beijing to Germany. So all these lines are start operating. Next, please. So another report on the newspaper in the official newspaper, People's Daily. Just to impress you, if you can read Chinese, continue, please.